Welcome to 1Corinthians. Introduction to the book of 1Corinthians. The letter that we now read as the book of 1Corinthians was written by Paul the Apostle around AD 55. Located on the narrow isthmus between the Aegean and Adriatic seas, Corinth was a port city and wealthy commercial center. Ships wanting to avoid the dangerous trip around the southern tip of Greece were dragged across the isthmus. The city boasted an outdoor theater that accommodated 20,000 people, athletic games second only to the Olympics, a Greek, Roman, and Oriental population, and the great temple of Aphrodite with its 1,000 prostitutes. The immoral condition of Corinth is vividly seen in the fact that the Greek term Korinthiazomai, literally to act the Corinthian, came to mean to practice fornication. There were taverns on the south side of the marketplace, and many drinking vessels have been dug up from those liquor lockers. Corinth was noted for everything sinful. The church in Corinth. The gospel was first preached in Corinth by Paul on his second missionary journey around AD 50. While living and working with Aquila and Priscilla, he preached in the synagogue until opposition forced him to move next door to the house of Titius Justus. The Jews accused him before the Roman governor Gallio, but the charge was dismissed, and Paul remained 18 months in the city, according to Acts chapter 18 verses 1 to 17 and 1 Corinthians chapter 2 verse 3. After leaving, Paul wrote the church a letter which was lost, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 9. But disturbing news about the believers and questions they asked Paul in a letter they sent him, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 1, prompted the writing of 1 Corinthians. Problems there included divisions in the church, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 11, immorality, 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verses 9 to 20, and the questions concerning marriage, food, worship, and the resurrection. Aberrant beliefs and practices of an astonishing variety characterized this church. The letter was written from Ephesus according to 1 Corinthians chapter 16 verse 8, and the contents of the letter is largely practical in emphasis, dealing with spiritual and moral problems and questions. It is a case book of pastoral theology. Important emphases include the judgment seat of Christ, 1 Corinthians chapter 3 verses 11 to 15, the temple of the Holy Spirit, 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verses 19 to 20, the glory of God, 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 31, the Lord's Supper, 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verses 23 to 34, love, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the exercise of gifts, 1 Corinthians chapters 12 and 14, and the resurrection, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. The outline of the book of 1 Corinthians. 1. Introduction, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verses 1 to 9. 1a. The salutation, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verses 1 to 3. 1b. The expression of thanks, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verses 4 to 9. 2. Divisions in the church, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 10 and 1 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 21. 2a. The fact of divisions, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 10 until verse 17. 2b. The causes of divisions, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 18 and 1 Corinthians chapter 2 verse 16. 2b1. The misunderstanding of God's message of the cross, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verses 18 and 1 Corinthians chapter 2 verse 5. 2b2. The misunderstanding of the Spirit's ministry of revealing, 1 Corinthians chapter 2 verses 6 to 16. 2c. The consequences of divisions, 1 Corinthians chapter 3 verse 1 and 1 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 5. 2c1. Spiritual growth is standard, 1 Corinthians chapter 3 verses 1 to 9. 2c2. Rewards will be lost, 1 Corinthians chapter 3 verse 10 and 1 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 5. 2D, the example of Paul. 1 Corinthians chapter 4 verses 6 to 21. 3. Moral disorders in the church. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 1 and 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 20. 3a, the case of incest. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 1 until verse 13. 3a1, the problem stated. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verses 1 to 2. 3a2, the punishment prescribed. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verses 3 to 13. 3b, the problem of litigation in heathen courts. 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verses 1 to 8. 3c, the warning against moral laxity. 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verses 9 to 20. 4. Discussion concerning marriage. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verses 1 to 40. 4a, marriage and celibacy. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verses 1 to 9. 4b, marriage and divorce. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verses 10 to 24. 4c, marriage and Christian service. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verses 25 to 38. 4d, marriage and remarriage. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verses 39 to 40. 5. Discussion concerning food offered to idols. 1 Corinthians chapter 8 verse 1 and 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 1. 5a, inquiry. May a Christian eat food consecrated to a pagan god? 1 Corinthians chapter 8 verses 1 to 13. 5b, example of Paul. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 verses 1 to 27. 5b1, Paul's rights. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 verses 1 to 14. 5b2, Paul's restrictions. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 verses 15 to 27. 5c, exhortations. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 1 and 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 1. 5c1, avoid self-indulgence. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verses 1 to 13. 5c2, do not participate in idol feasts. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verses 14 to 22. 5c2, do not participate in idol feasts. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verses 14 to 22. 5c3, glorify God by seeking the welfare of your brother. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verses 23 and 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 1. 6. Discussion concerning public worship. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 2 and 1 Corinthians chapter 14 verse 40. 6a, the veiling of women. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verses 2 to 16. 6b, the Lord's Supper. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verses 17 to 34. 6c, the use of spiritual gifts. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 verse 1 and 1 Corinthians chapter 14 verse 40. 6c1, the varieties of gifts. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 verses 1 to 11. 6c2, the purpose of gifts, unity in diversity. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 verses 12 to 31. 6c3, the supremacy of love over gifts. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 verses 1 to 13. 6c4, the superiority of prophecy over tongues. 1 Corinthians chapter 14 verses 1 to 25. 6c5, the regulations for the use of gifts. 1 Corinthians chapter 14 verses 26 to 40. 7. The doctrine of the resurrection. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 1 to 58. 7a, the importance of the resurrection. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 1 to 11. 7b, the consequences of denying the resurrection. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 12 to 19. 7c, the Christian hope. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 20 to 34. 7d, the resurrection body. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 35 to 50. 7e, the Christian's victory through Christ. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 51 to 58. 8. Practical and personal matters. 1 Corinthians chapter 16 verses 1 to 24. 8a, the collection for the saints in Jerusalem. 1 Corinthians chapter 16 verses 1 to 4. 8b, the planned visit of Paul. 1 Corinthians chapter 16 verses 5 to 9. And finally, 8c, exhortations, greetings, and benedictions. 1 Corinthians chapter 16 verses 10 to 24. The end of the introduction to the book of 1 Corinthians.